joining. So welcome to our British Future webinar on the new immigration figures, the biggest numerical decline on record, and what these figures mean for the future direction of policy and debate. So as expected, the numbers do show this marked fall. Many of you maybe have been expecting it, but as our polling shows, this will be a surprise to most people, most of the public who expect there would have been an increase in the levels of net migration. And this is probably due to the high profile of immigration in political debate and in the media, and its focus on numbers and the promises by the current and the former government to bring immigration numbers down. So that's what we're here to look at and discuss, in particular, whether the levels of net migration are going to fall further, and what does that mean for future policy and for the nature of the debate. And so does it mean in particular that some of the tough measures of the white paper published last week won't be carried through if they look like they're going to interfere with plans for growth? And will attention shift back to irregular migration? And generally, how will current developments play out? So to answer these questions, we've got four experts on immigration. We have Christabel Cooper, who is Director of Research at Labour Together. Then we have Marley Morris, who leads IPPR's work on immigration and trade policy. We have Will Prescott, who's Senior Fellow at the centre-right think tank Bright Blue. And last but not least, we have Sundar Katwala, Director of British Futures. So each panellist will give a short take on the statistics and on the next steps for policy and debate. I'll then ask a few questions and then open up discussion to you. So get your questions ready and do ask them in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen. Should be quite obvious, hopefully. I will start off by asking Marley for his take on the figures and their implications. Over to you.
Great, thank you, Heather. So I'll just give a brief overview of the figures, and for those who haven't yet seen, as Heather said, it's a striking drop in net migration, nearly half the levels of 2023, going down to 431,000. That's immigration subtracted by emigration to make for net migration. So that's a really dramatic fall compared to only a year or two ago. We had net migration of nearly a million, of around 900,000. So now this is largely driven by falls in work and study migration, and also a little bit of a rise in emigration as well. I'll just to give a brief overview of why this has happened. So first of all, we've had around 49% decrease in immigration for work for main work applicants, which accounts for the biggest fall in immigration. And that is primarily driven by a very sharp drop in visas for care workers, which was because of the Home Office's greater scrutiny of their applications, and in particular how they administered the genuine vacancy test. And basically, I think the Home Office wasn't fully aware of exactly how social care providers manage their contracts with local authorities, and so there was a huge amount of abuse and exploitation on the route, and also employers signing up to sponsorship when they actually didn't have enough hours for people who they were recruiting. And now the government have clamped down on that. They've reviewed the way they apply the genuine vacancy test, and that has led to a very sharp fall in successful applications for social care visas. At the same time, we've also seen a increase in the salary thresholds, which was all under the last government, and that's had some impacts on skilled work visas as well, in particular hospitality, where salaries tend to be lower. And so again, you've seen some falls there too. And then alongside that, there's been these changes in independent policy as well, and again under the last government, restrictions in students and in workers, care workers being able to bring their family members with them on their courses, and that's led to some very sharp falls. So an 86% reduction in number of study dependents and a 35% fall in number of work dependents. It's also been a something of a fall in study in sort of main applicants for study as well, around 17%, perhaps a bit less than people thought. I think there was some signs that the impact of the study dependent policy could be quite dramatic, but it's been perhaps a bit moderated. And again, I think again there are some tough trade-offs ahead for the government as it manages the debate over migration levels and the need for universities to fund their courses. Um, and then finally, just on emigration, there's also been a slight rise in emigration of non-EU migrants who originally came on study visas. And again, that's kind of to be expected because there was this big surge in students coming just post-pandemic. And now, of course, as people finish their courses or they finish their time on the graduate route, then they're now increasingly leaving because those routes do not provide a pathway to settlement. So that's no surprise. And I think as we go forward, we'll probably see a continuing these trends. Further falls in net migration, perhaps not as dramatic as this one, but certainly some further falls, both as a result of some of these sort of natural trends, but also as a result of the government's white paper published last week. Um, uh, at the same time, the figures today also said that asylum applications were a record high. Some of that to do with small boats, but actually only a third of applications are from people who came on small boats. Actually, a big part of it is people coming, for instance, to study and then making applications once they've arrived. It's putting huge pressure on the asylum system still. Whilst the backlog is slightly down on initial decisions, it's still far higher than it was pre-pandemic, and we're still far off exiting asylum hotels, which of course is a big pledge for the government. So just very briefly on kind of what the lessons are. I think the fall on net migration suggests that there needs to be a very careful balance going forward. Think about, on the one hand, managing levels of net migration, which are, expected to come down a bit further, but also the government's other priorities, whether it's on economic growth, whether it's on restoring our public services, and particular implications for social care and healthcare, and of course on community cohesion. And there are fiscal implications too, because reductions of this level will probably have some effect for the OBR's forecasts as well, and of course the kind of the space, the fiscal space that the government has, and of course that's a particularly challenging area for them at the moment on a number of fronts. And then at the same time, it's likely that small boats and asylum will perhaps become the growing focus of those who are concerned about immigration. That's where the public are most concerned, and it's where the numbers are still high, and the government has less of a clear story to tell. And I think this is the final thing I'd say is I think this points again to something and I know others have called for in the past. But there's a real value, I think, in thinking through immigration carefully and looking through the different trade-offs rather than just looking at this overall number. And I think the value of an annual immigration plan to work through the different aspects of immigration policy, how they trade off with, for instance, your policy on social care, on economic growth, on house building, on higher education finances, and how you manage that debate between government departments. I think would be a really valuable way to develop immigration policy and also have a more constructive debate rather than focusing on one number, but thinking about the different strands of immigration and how you manage those trade-offs within government, and that would hopefully help to have a more constructive and thoughtful public debate on this difficult issue.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. Some really, really good points there. As you say, there does need to be a very careful balance, and there could be a danger it could kind of tip the other way, and it could impact on Labour's other plans more widely. And as you say, there are trade-offs. I'll come back to you later. The question. So, if people have questions at this point for Marley for later, if you could start putting them in the Q&A, that would be great. So over to you next, Christabel, for your take on the figures and what they mean.
Thank you very much. So I'm the Director of Research at Labour Together, so I do all our public opinion work. I'd like to stress that I'm not here on behalf of the government. I'm an observer rather than a participant. But what I did want to make some observations on is the relationship between the salience of migration in public opinion. So that's the percentage of people that cite immigration as the most important issue facing the country, and the relationship between that and net migration figures. Now, in the past, this has been a fairly strong relationship. So if we look at the numbers rising to what was then historic highs just before Brexit, you saw the salience of immigration rise in almost lockstep with it. But over the recent few years, actually, that relationship has somewhat broken down. In part, I think that's because, we've had COVID, we've had Liz Truss, other issues have sort of pushed migration down the list of people's priorities. But it is nevertheless striking that numbers got to those heights that Marley was mentioning, nearly 1 million net migrants coming into the country, which is about 3 times the number that we had just before Brexit. And yet the salience of migration at that point was half what it was in 2015. So what does seem to be driving so what you saw in salience was, it is creeping up from a very low base around about 2020. But what seems to be driving that is less the overall net migration numbers and more the small boats numbers. And we know this from polling that is the primary concern that people who are worried about migration have. And we also know that people tend to overestimate the percentage that asylum seekers are coming in small boats and their dependents are of that total migration number. And they also tend to believe that those people are not genuine asylum seekers, that they have got into small boats because they are trying to cheat the system, rather than because for most refugees, there are no other safe or legal routes to come to the UK. So when you take those things into consideration, it is not surprising, therefore, that it is small boats numbers that seem to be driving public perceptions or public attitudes towards migration. It reconciles with the finding that sort of, Sundar and many others have keep telling us that if you go through each profession, like doctors, nurses, people will always say that they are quite happy with the number of migrants, or in fact want more, and yet overall they want migration reduced. And that can be explained by the fact that they disproportionately think that asylum seekers are a larger part of that overall number. And so when we did some polling looking at how people would react to falls in migration numbers, we found that people were pretty happy if we told them that migration would fall by half. And in fact, they had very little preference between that and falling to the numbers before Brexit, or even falling to zero. It really just was those small boat numbers that they were really, really concerned about them coming down. So I would expect that the government is pretty happy to see, to be able to have the headline that net migration has fallen in half. But they will be mindful of the fact that, nevertheless, these are by historical standards, still really high numbers. They are higher than they were before the Brexit referendum. And we know that, in a large part, that the result of the Brexit referendum was driven by concern about those numbers. These numbers will continue to put pressure, certainly on housing. And, again, this is just speculation on my part, so don't take it as gospel. They may also be wanting to see numbers come down in order to be able to announce some kind of EU youth experience, or whatever it is that they come to an arrangement with, which would see young people coming from Europe into the country. So I think that's kind of the background behind the white paper, where obviously they were looking to reduce these numbers even further. But I think it's kind of quite interesting that, generally, I think the sort of consensus is that it won't reduce, the white paper measures won't reduce migration by much more than 100,000, which would still leave these numbers at a relatively high historic level. And I think that that's because, just as Marley was saying, lower migration numbers do have impacts elsewhere. They have impacts on social care, on other public services. They have impacts on the all-important OBR forecast. So I think the government is trying to maintain this balance between wanting to be able to bring those numbers down, but also wanting to deliver on the other priorities that they have, particularly economic growth and improvements in public services. I think they would definitely argue that, they've been accused of trying to out-reform, and I think they would argue that that's not what they're trying to do. They're very well aware that the vast majority of reform voters are not, they are ex-Tory or ex-UKIP voters. They're not people who would naturally vote Labour. The voters that they are trying to target tend to be the ones that voted Labour in 2024, and so maybe about 10% of that vote has now moved to Reform. But they tend to be probably more at the, out of the universe of Reform voters, probably the ones that are slightly less hardline about migration. So I think they're trying to balance all of those all of those things. And I'd just like to sort of very much echo again what sort of Marley said. At Labour Together, we've also advocated that a sort of migration budget might be a more sensible way of having a conversation with the public about the pros and cons of migration. I'm sure Sundar will come on to talk about his balances. We know that the majority of the British public both see pros and cons in migration. So actually having a public conversation about what those pros and cons are might be helpful in what can be a sort of conversation that takes place certainly in the media and on social media between people shrieking at each other from either ends of the spectrum. I think the problem that the government still has is small boats. It is asylum hotels. Asylum hotels are very visible reminders of government policy of the consequence of small boats coming over. And I think that the white paper obviously didn't address that, and I think they will face further political problems unless they are able to get those numbers significantly falling.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Christabel. As you say, small boats have dominated the debate, and it seems that some of the discourse around migration generally, even though it's supposed to be about work, it sounds like it's more like for asylum, and that's probably how the public will hear it and receive it. Thank you very much for those points. Over to you, Will.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Look, I'm Will. I'm a senior research fellow at Bright Blue, and as you can possibly tell from the strange accent, I'm also a migrant myself, having come from Australia 9 years ago. And despite the Home Office's best efforts, I'm still here. So look, I don't think that these figures are going to change the scope of the debate that drastically. I think as Christabel pointed out a moment ago, at sort of the 431,000 a year, that's still substantially higher than around around sort of 250,000 figure net migration that we saw in 2015, the last sort of pre-Brexit year. Look, and it's also worth stressing again that some fall in migration was inevitable from sort of the record sort of 900,000 peak that we saw a couple of years ago. Sort of delay, the sort of the COVID era delays in people starting that physically coming into the country and then leaving again. Also, sort of one-off factors like Hong Kong, like the Hong Kong visas and the various Ukraine schemes. But I think fundamentally, yeah, migration still remains at very high levels by historical standards, and it's not really possible to out-reform on these particular issues. Nigel Farage is now sort of in a rather clever piece of marketing called for net zero migration, a clever way to address two issues in one stone. And there's really no way for sort of a mainstream party of either the centre left or the centre right to do that, because the trade-offs involved will sort of be very substantial. And I think that this really sort of comes back to, where should instead we go to from here? And again, sort of building up from what Christabel was saying, and from what Marley was saying, I think a lot of it does come down to the public's sense of needing to have a sense of control over migration. I think part of the reason that migration ceased to be as salient politically after Brexit was because people thought after free movement with Europe had ended, a few more people may come in, but ultimately, if we want to turn the taps off tomorrow, we can do that. With the substantially higher number of migrants that have come sort of post Brexit under the relaxation of skilled worker and other rules, but also particularly with the small boats, there's a real sense, I think, that control has sort of been lost. So that sort of raises the obvious question of where do we go to from here? And of course, I would do this because I was editor of it, but Bright Blue did publish an essay collection recently containing a number of ideas for how we might sort of reform the education system. And I think for us, some of the key ideas were control, cohesion, and contribution. We've got to give the British public a sense that it does have the final say in who comes. We also have got to make it clear that those who come to this country are making a contribution, and we also should be fostering sort of social cohesion. And again, so if you look at the sort of there are lots of competing priorities, and again, this comes to the point that we need to explain some of the trade-offs. Yes, there is a very strong democratic argument. We've seen polling consistently say for a while that people do want lower overseas net migration, but also people do support have different attitudes towards different types of migration. There was no opposition to the Hong Kong scheme. People thought that was the right thing to do. There was a lot of support for Ukraine, and we did some polling, I think, about it in 2015, which feels like a lifetime ago, given everything that's happened since. And there was support for overseas students, and we've also got a very strong economic need. Our universities, as was previously mentioned, need some of the international student revenue, but also a lot of businesses, smaller businesses, do need some foreign talent to plug the gaps in the labour market. So we proposed a couple of measures sort of centered around the cohesion, control, and contribution. So around sort of skilled workers. The government's already done this, but uprating the skilled worker visa threshold in line with individual earnings just makes sense. Otherwise, it will just naturally attrit away, if that's a word, over time. But also, there does need to be some flexibility built into this, because obviously incomes vary across lifetimes. So one proposal is that you look at that you sort of say, well, for younger workers who may be just transitioning off the graduate route and people who we do want to keep in the country, that we do sort of alter the salary threshold based on that, but for that sort of flexibility as well. But also, I do think it sort of again touching on the point about small boats, because although the numbers themselves aren't enormous, the psychological toll of the issue is considerable. It does mean that we do need to start looking at cooperating with our European partners on whether it be sort of offshore processing or some form of offshore regime, because ultimately it's only through sort of cooperation with Europe that we can, particularly countries like France, that we do sort of stop those, we do sort of try to stop the boats. And that does also mean creating more safe and legal routes, as has already been mentioned, because it is, with a few very limited exceptions, it is very difficult to sort of seek asylum in the UK. And also, if we do want to sort of, help, we do want to reduce the cost of sort of asylum processing claims, we could look at reduce the time during which asylum seekers are not allowed to work. Currently, they're forced to be a drain on the system because they're not physically entitled to work at all. That doesn't benefit them. It doesn't benefit anyone. So with that, I will shut up. But that's a couple of ideas from us.
Yeah, really interesting ideas. Thank you, Will. I like the control, cohesion, contribution. That those are also principles that have come out very strongly from our work. I think that the public prefers a system that exerts control rather than reduces numbers. I think around about 2-1 in the Immigration Tracker survey. So thank you very much. So Sunda, over to you.
Thanks, Heather. Thank the others for taking part as well. I think one of the things that today's numbers lead us think is, do numbers matter? Does the net migration number matter? How much does it matter? Should we have the debate about this number? Should we have the debate about other numbers. And, the media is focusing on the fall in immigration because the net migration number has come out. You had to be a sort of wonk or a pointy head to point out that we already had the visa data quite a long time ago. So we knew about something in a way we didn't know about, not just the public, but the elite. So that's focused the debate. The Labour Party in opposition very much was scathing about net migration. They would say net migration isn't the kind of thing we're that interested in. You're lumping it all together. Students aren't the same as refugees and family migration and high skills and low skills, and we don't control immigration and so on. And in government, they're now very committed to reducing the level of net migration specifically. So they've decided that net migration does matter, as well as it being made up of different things. We've obviously had a long history of the last sort of decade and a half. The net migration number becomes the big focus because David Cameron spots this tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands soundbite in a focus group. People think they're talking about immigration, not net migration, because he's offering people net migration at about about 100,000. He's offering immigration about 500,000 or 600,000, but it sounds very low, and they couldn't deliver it. And so we've been stuck on net migration as the number, and it'd be good to disaggregate it. But I think there's a reason it does matter as well, which is that and there's a sort of social democratic reason that I think the Labour government could use. They're using other people's arguments for reduced immigration. I think they should use their own argument, which is that in a decade of renewal, they want to build a lot of houses, and they want the housing supply to outstrip the contribution to population change. And if the net migration number is above 700,000, then the population change, and just look at the people who are settling, not necessarily the net migration as measured, is going to outstrip the housing supply. And when you get it down to the kinds of numbers it's now heading towards, you don't have to be a very, very busy hamster to keep ahead of it. You still got to be very organised. And so that is, I think, something that they could have done. So I think Keir Starmer could have prepared for this moment better with his white paper. He brought out a white paper with quite tough language, not telling people this was going to happen. These aren't Keir Starmer's policy changes. He's kept the policy changes the Conservative government adopted in a panic in December 2023. The Conservative government could have cut immigration a bit earlier than it did. It had taken its eye off the ball. I think it had done good things it was proud of: Ukraine, Hong Kong, graduate visas, and so on. It took its eye off the ball, I think, around the way the health and social care visa was used. It was not well monitored. There's obviously people who did very good work in social care. There was also exploitation and abuse of that route that should have been better monitored. They monitored it later. They took their eye off the ball about how the student and graduate visas and dependent visas would be used. That's created a lot of concern and fear among universities. So we've lost a lot of dependents where, two people were coming, one person was doing a master's and it was a chance to study and work, or mainly to work. Other people are, studying and wanting to work afterwards and pay off the fees. That's a good thing when it's being done for the right reason. So I think Starmer would have surprised people a lot if he'd said, you've heard a lot of promises that people can't keep, but I think I've looked at it carefully. A promise I can keep is I'll halve the number I inherited in the first 2 years, and I'll get it down to that level, and I'll keep it below that ceiling, which is where it's going, to sort of, net 350,000 or so on. I think he should have said that first, and people would have said, I don't know if you can do that. That sounds like more you can do. And obviously, because it was so high, he could do that. And then I think he should treat that as a ceiling and not make a further promise about a number, because who knows what Donald Trump will be up to? Who knows what's going to happen in Taiwan? Who knows what our economic needs, how these trade policies are going to go? He should have offered to come back every year in Parliament, I think, and have the immigration plan. And I'll tell you about the impacts. I'll tell you about who's come. I'll tell you how I've used the health surcharge. I'll tell you how my housing policy's going. I'll tell you if I'm tweaking things, and so on. I think that would have done what Marley, Christabel, Will have all talked about, which is put that pressures and gains, trade-offs argument front and centre. And you could then conclude, actually, we can go from 300 to 200. So I think the Labour government is in a strange position now where they're opposed to a net migration target, but they want net migration to come down. They're saying the halved level is unsustainable, but they can't tell us what the sustainable level is, because they're worried that saying 250,000 or something would be too high. So I say, why not set a ceiling, 0.5% of population, 300, half the level you had, set that as a ceiling, and then say within that, you're not going to make extravagant promises. You're going to look at all of the pressures and gains for universities, for health services, etc., manage it down where you can, keep it and defend it where you can't, and then ask other people. As Will said, other people will say numbers like zero. The new analysis says that if net migration was zero, the population would fall by 70,000 or 100,000 a year. So you might need slightly above that if you don't want a falling population. Then you've got to decide, can you manage it? So I think Starmer still has the opportunity to go to that middle ground. I think it's in his strongly his interest to do so, because at the next general election he'll be defending actual immigration he's decided to have. It might be 200,000, it might be 300,000, it might be 350,000. In Downing Street, they're a bit worried, and this is the scars of the Poland decision. They're a bit worried that if they say it's heading down to 300, but what if it turns out to be 600 because we don't know, because we don't control it, and what if it gets out of hand, and so on. And I think that's probably not the case, because it's easier to manage immigration in a post-Brexit world because you're managing the visas and you don't know what immigration is going to be. So I think that's one of the reasons they don't want to relax, having halved it. But I think they're being noisier than their policy. I think they could be calmer, they could be controlled. And then I think I would like to see a pro-citizenship policy. And I think the weakest part of the policy is having some rhetoric about citizenship, but no integration policy, no citizenship policy. I think that's the missing piece. In the end, I think we've all said it, it's the visibility of the lack of control of boats that is the difficult bit. He was handed an easy job, I think, on immigration numbers, because the last government cut it in half too late to benefit them and gave him a reduced level. And I think he could defend the level he's got or bring it down a bit. And they gave him a really difficult inheritance on boats and asylum, not because, as he says, and it's a silly line to use in my view, not because they were an open borders party, but because they closed the asylum system and said they would remove everybody and couldn't remove anybody, and so gave him a massive backlog. So his job is to get effective, workable control of asylum. That's about multilateralism. It's about talking to France. It's about enforcement, but it's about routes. It's about returns. It's about processing claims. It's about dealing with the hotels issue. I think the success or failure of a Labour government on immigration will depend on whether they can show that they can control asylum humanely and in an orderly way. Because I think they can control immigration and visa immigration. And as Christabel has told us, people getting a sense that it's controlled is much more important what the number is, because the British Future data shows that people will never really have an idea about whether it's 200,000 or 300,000. They'll have an idea about whether governments are making sensible decisions or are getting it wrong one way or the other. They could get it wrong by losing grip on the numbers. They could get it wrong by refusing to let care homes have workers that they need. So I think we've got an opportunity for a new phase of the debate, but I think we need less political tactics, less political rhetoric, more governing competently in order to take the opportunity to regain trust at this moment.
Yes, thank you very much, Sander. So I think we're all agreed here, you're all agreed anyway, that the priority is asylum rather than migration for work, in terms of showing that action is being taken, that control is more important than numbers as far as the public's concerned. And also you're also all agreed on the migration plan. So a bit of sort of devil's advocate on this. Is it not quite a difficult thing to see through, given that demand for migration is going to change over the course of a year in terms of demand from particular sectors, and also is the public, given that the public is more concerned about control than numbers, is it something that the public is really going to engage in? That's one question that I wanted to put to you. The other one really is around the flexibility that might be, should the government have a more flexible approach. If you delve deep into the white paper, you can see that there is provision for having sort of temporary removal of restrictions in some sectors where there's an economic need, and so that then the requirement would go down from the quite high degree level which it's been set at to what it was before, basically intermediate level. And I wonder whether you think actually that will be enacted, which I think probably you'd have to say yes, because it's so restrictive at the moment. It's really going to be a big problem for sectors like construction, who have relied on intermediate skills to fill labour shortages. And if that does happen, what then happens to public trust? Could that be seen as, oh, we know the government promised these restrictions, and now it's removed them, and we've got people coming in who do. Is that going to be an issue? Who would like to go first on that? And then I'll go to the on those two broad questions, and then I'll go to some of the questions in the Q&A. Marley, do you want to start?
Sure, I can take the second of those, if you like, Heather, because I feel like the first one, I'm sure others will be keen to chip in on. The second, second question. I think, well, obviously the government have said that they want this idea of a temporary shortage list as part of their plan. I think that's sensible. I don't think there'd be much public backlash to that. I mean, as the work that I know that you've done at British Future said, actually, a lot of the jobs that people are quite comfortable with tend to be jobs that might not be qualify under the kind of degree level skills threshold, like in construction and in care and so on. I think there was a question, I think, about how much that will actually be used in practice. And if you look, for instance, at the moment on construction, I mean, those construction occupations have not been used heavily. I mean, there's not many construction jobs that are sponsored by employers, partly because often the way the construction industry works, quite often small businesses, or they don't necessarily have the capacity to navigate the sponsorship system. Also, an English language requirement can be a bit of a restriction. So it depends exactly how the government enact that. But in practice, it may be that actually those temporary shortage lists aren't used heavily. Hospitality is another one, which I think could be potentially, that's potentially an option. For instance, chefs or butchers may end up on the list, depending on what the Migration Advisory Committee considers. But again, the numbers we're not talking about huge numbers here in the scheme of things. So I think actually this will be a relatively small part of the overall net migration debate. It'll be an important part though, because I think it'll be about how you can work with business to see where you can improve conditions, where you can improve investment in skills. But I guess there needs to be a quid pro quo if that's going to work. Because at the moment, actually, the system isn't really designed for those types of occupations anyway. So it hasn't been used heavily. So I think that's the key question for me, I guess. And maybe there'll be something. I know that there's some parts of government that are quite keen, for instance, to increase the number of people coming in on construction, and because of it helps their house building target. So there might be some further liberalisation there that could be done. Again, again, needs to be designed carefully, because obviously you want to make sure that you're thinking long term to support domestic skills as well. But you can see there being potentially a kind of some bespoke routes for some occupations where the current system actually hasn't been working well for them.
So you don't think that would be a problem in terms of public response to flexibilities that would be introduced? Yeah, thank you. And Adam in the Q&A has made the point that migrants will be needed to for building projects that for housing and other parts of the sector. Who would like to go next?
I could go. I mean, I guess sort of my concern is, and you've seen this throughout the past few years, there's always sort of knee-jerk reactions to things. So if the government feels there's this strong political imperative to keep, has made this strong pledge around numbers and needs to keep numbers down, if there is suddenly a shortage in one sector, it may do that, and maybe it won't make much of a difference, but then it will sort of feel compelled to make a trade-off in some other area. And sort of try to cut to cut the numbers by making it up somewhere else. And that's just not a very effective way to create a long-term stable and effective migration system. I think these constant U-turns from liberalizing skilled worker visas to tightening skilled worker visas to abolishing the graduate route, bringing it back, reducing it again. I don't think that's a good way to make policy. So that would be my sort of concern on that front.
Okay, too many changes. Yeah, thank you, Christabel.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to that. I mean, from everything that I can see in public opinion research, what really bothers people is the idea that migrants are not making a contribution to the UK, or that they are taking out more than they put in. So I think to sort of Sundar's point, do people care about how many hundreds of thousands of people are coming in and out? I would be skeptical of whether people are aware of exact numbers. What they want to feel, certainly with economic migration or non non-asylum migration is that people are doing, that they're here for a purpose, that they are doing something that will benefit the country. So I think that anything that really just speaks to explaining why we have these numbers, I think would be helpful for the public debate.
Yeah.
And just to build on that, I think the principles of the white paper, where they are control, we should decide what's in our interests and our values, I would add. Contribution, we're selecting people who want to contribute, which doesn't always mean the people on the higher salaries, it means the people we need to do important things. And cohesion, citizenship, contact, that all matters. Those are good principles. I actually think there's then a contradiction in the policy when they do this sort of two-tier and three-tier policy, and I think they're misreading where the public are, because for long-term fiscal impact, you might prefer guest workers if they are mid-level jobs, guest workers without dependents who come and go and don't stay back. There's obviously an integration cost if those people come in larger numbers, because, you know, not that Keir Starmer should be using the language of strangers, but in a way it's more churn, it's more strangers, it's less people coming and settling as families, and, you know, that might be good. But like, you wanted some temporary work and you didn't want people to stay, but it's also it's more difficult there, and people might not want it. You know, that might not be the most attractive offer that people have got as to where you can go and be a construction worker. So it might be, as Marley says, that it doesn't happen in a great way. If we need people to come and we take them in limited numbers, I don't think people have a view that the people that we need who are doing something useful to build houses, they must never settle. I think they want to know whether they're the right kinds of people with the right motive. So I think they've slightly misread that people like temporary migration and don't want people to settle. I think people like settlement and citizenship migration, where people's kids get to be British, and they're okay with a bit of temporary migration in agriculture if it's handled really well. But I don't think we want that. We want that as a norm. So I think this graduate jobs welcome, other people, come and go, guest working, there's a cost to doing it. So I'd prefer not to go down that route too much. But I don't think the problem is having permission to have people who are doing useful work.
Yeah, thank you. So that really leads us in nicely to some of the questions in the Q&A relate to citizenship, the proposed changes in citizenship extension to 10 years. And a specific question from a BNO around this. Now, I'm aware that there is concern in the Hong Kong BNO community in the UK, with many of them coming up to the first 5 years, that actually the rug's going to be pulled under their feet, and they'd be required to wait 10 years. I don't think that's the case for people already here, but nevertheless, as Sundar said, that's a kind of nod to, actually, we prefer people, or the idea is we prefer people who maybe don't stay that long. We're not really going to allow people. We're not so much in favour of people staying, integrating, settling, which does go against what people say in research, and particularly focus group research, where that comes across quite strongly. So, I mean, what does the panel think of that measure, the extending citizenship to 10 years? Is there anyone who thinks it has a positive side, or what do you think would be the downsides or the problems with that approach?
If I can just come in here with a piece of polling that we did about a year ago, where we divided our sample into two groups. We showed one, a scenario where a building contractor had come from Nigeria 20 years ago to live and work in the UK and had taken UK citizenship, and the other scenario in which exactly the same person had come to the UK, lived here 20 years and had not taken citizenship. And we found a really significant gap in whether people had thought he had made a contribution, an economic contribution to Britain. People thought that in the scenario where he'd taken citizenship, he was much more likely to have made a contribution to Britain. So I will just leave it there, that's what the great British public think about migrants taking citizenship.
Thank you. Who wants to go next? Will, does Bright Blue have a position on citizenship?
I mean, I think, yeah, sort of in the essay collection, we did sort of come out in favor of extending the period. I think the main justification was that it does sort of as a measure to sort of help reduce chain migration. Sort of people, and again, if a concern is sort of trying to control the numbers, chain migration is one person comes and then they might sponsor or bring some, bring dependents over. So that, and if your sort of goal is to sort of for contribution as well, you can make the argument that if you're sort of paying, for example, the national health surcharge longer, if you're sort of paying into the system for longer, that there is a greater period before you're able to sort of access the benefits of citizenship. I guess sort of the question for me is, and it's not, I think initially it wasn't clear, and then they've said, does this apply to those people who are already here or not? Because I think there is sort of an argument that if people have sort of come here on a 5-year route, on the expectation that having done everything right and sort of performed well in their job and not, done anything, not breached any of the laws, that rug is going to be pulled out from underneath them. I'd like to see how that pans out in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't aware that could happen. I mean, it's possible, but it would seem extremely unfair, particularly since that was part of the deal of the BNO visa, on which many,
Oh, sorry, I'm not sure about BNO. I mean, I couldn't, but this is sort of about sort of those who came under sort of who are on existing skilled worker visa holders, because obviously there are different 5-year routes. Um,
yeah,
and whether existing holders of skilled worker visas would be affected by, it would suddenly be told you've got to wait 10 years rather than 5.
yeah, and they might have reasonably expected that after renewal of their first visa, they'd be well on the way, and that might have been part of their thinking in terms of wanting a settled life in the UK. Marley, is this something that IPPR have looked into, the kind of citizenship and settlement route?
Yeah, I mean, we're concerned about the extension. We think that risks inhibiting integration. We think that it also makes people more vulnerable and more likely to fall off their limited leave to remain, and so that makes them potentially more vulnerable to exploitation, to poverty. We've looked at the 10-year route. Does it currently exist for people on specific human rights family life routes? And that, is a really challenging route for people to be on. They have to reapply very regularly, pay huge amounts of fees. They are at risk of falling off the route and becoming irregular, as I was saying. And they haven't got access to support. And often in many cases, you have single parents with children on the route, and so I think there's a risk there in particular for child poverty. So extending the route, I think we would definitely have concerns about. It's worth saying that the government have said they're open to consultation on this, and there are quite a few sort of options about how this could work in practice. So I think there are potential, there may be ways to reform the system to make it easier, for instance, for some people who are currently on the 10-year route to get this idea of earned settlement after 5 years. So there might be ways that actually this policy could have positive impacts if the reforms are quite wide ranging. Look at Germany, for instance. There's a route to get settlement or citizenship after 3 years if you demonstrate kind of really high degrees of integration, for instance, demonstrating volunteering and so on. And the key question here is that is this concept of earning settlement simply about your fiscal contribution, or is it more broadly about your social contribution, about other ways that you can contribute? And it sounds like the government has got a wider understanding of contribution. So hopefully, there's a way to kind of reform the system which could have some improvements. But we're certainly concerned about the overall idea of lengthening it. And it's worth saying, just on the BNO, I know that a Labour MP, I think, asked a question in Parliament to the Immigration Minister, Seema Malhotra. I think her answer to that was basically that I think potentially there's no specific rule saying it's only going to apply to people on work visas. So at the moment it's open to any particular route. I think other than maybe people on the specific family 5-year routes that currently exist. But other than that, the white paper left things open. And indeed, they've left things open for people who are already here as well,
Okay.
and said that's going to be open to consultation later this year. I do think that is really important, and obviously it's clear from the questions on this call. Like it's really important, I think, for the government to clarify as soon as they can about people who are currently here, because I know it's a real concern for lots of people. And it's just gives too much uncertainty for people. I think there's also a risk of a legal challenge as well. Particularly if this is done through secondary legislation, because there is a precedent, for instance, of where the government tried to change the rules on settlement before, where there was a successful legal challenge on that. So I think that the government does risk getting kind of falling down into a bit of a rabbit hole if it does try to affect people who are currently living in the UK. And I think there are real risks to doing that.
Yes, and you
Yes,
then think, what would be the point? Sonder.
Yeah, I think the consultation is going to really matter. I think it's very sketchy. I think the reason it's sketchy is this was very back of the envelope. And there's a sort of rhetorical point that is not a bad point. And I think it reflects what Will was saying, which is that we want to value contribution more. And so maybe it shouldn't all be automatic. Maybe we should think about how to signal contribution and so on. I think there's a really good principle generally that you make rules. When you change the rules, you change the rules for the future, but you don't affect people retrospectively. People on a temporary visa and a work visa who haven't got citizenship yet, if you change the rules, it will affect them. They might have had expectations, but you can change rules. How fair is that? I think will be contested. In the British Future Research, 6 out of 10 people think 5 years is about right. And a few people say never. I think there's an ugly politics underneath this. The Conservative Party have said 15 years for citizenship, 10 for ILR, 5 more for citizenship, and Labour sort of followed suit. And some of what's driving that on the right is around the specific people who came here under Boris Johnson. That there are think tanks and MPs saying, well, just because they came, it doesn't mean we can't get lots of them to leave, most of them to leave. So if they have got expectations they can stay, let's tell them they can't. And there's almost a sort of mainstream use of the language of remigration, which is also used, in a very ugly way by the far right to mean, all the migrants, all the minorities, and so on. That there's a kind of let's get people to leave debate, because that's the only reason I think the Conservatives have got 15 years, that they want to say it's Labour's fault if the so-called Boris wave is the language they use. If the Boris wave stay, Starmer could have gotten to leave, and we won't still have settled them. Well, I think that's bad. I think this will hurt Labour quite a lot in its internal politics. One thing they've forgotten, because we tend to think of migrants as being relatively, powerless in a political system. There are lots of people with settlement, for example, who can't vote in general elections. Lots of people from the Commonwealth can vote in general elections, and also because we're not a island of strangers, there are lots of people in London who are, white British settled migrants, British citizens who know people through faith, family, work, etc., who are worrying about this question. So I think the consultation will matter. What they were sort of saying is we'll have a fast track as well. Is the fast track just currently the current rules? And does it just apply to sort of very special people who work for the NHS, or is that the normal track? And there'll be some people on 10 years. And I think some of the points IPR have been raising. What is the impact? If we leave out people who are going to settle and stay, who can least afford it, and charge them more, what's the impact on child poverty? And so it's just a consultation of all of it. What are the necessary barriers to citizenship? Yes, English language. Yes, criminal checks. Yes, character. What are the unnecessary barriers? More cost if you're staying anyway. And how do we get that? How do we get that balance right? I think it's much fairer to say to people who are currently wondering whether to come to Britain or might be just coming in their first year, here are the rules in the future. I think if we take people who arrived 3 years ago and say, actually, we've got to change everything now, we don't want to do it, even if that is, in a way, a future policy change, I think it will fail a fairness intuition for a lot of people. And I think it won't achieve what the government wants, which is more integration and more contribution.
Yeah, thank you. So we don't have long left. So I want to pick up a question that is in the Q&A and then add something as a kind of conclusion. So students, so we can see from the data to date that international student numbers, I think, have fallen, but not by very much. And so I think the question then is from me to you then is what do you think? How do you think that will pan out, given that there's particular problems in the university sector, financial problems, and universities are quite dependent on international students, as we know. And then if you can also then say another question, another set of questions from the chat is basically what do you expect to see in terms of future migration figures for the next quarter? How do you expect things to develop? Do you think they might sort of go up or again, or do you think they might go substantially down or not very much? So if you can each of you say a few words about those things, students, and also the general direction of the immigration figures. Will, do you want to start?
I guess the students one. I mean, it's a tough one. I mean, I think if you, unless you would, I'd be surprised if, say, reducing the graduate visa route from 2 years to 18 months is going to make that much of a difference. 6 months extra to find a sponsored job. I'd be surprised if that made if that substantially altered things. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just you can't really. I think it's politically very risky to let sort of large universities collapse. A lot of universities have become very, very dependent on student revenue. I'd also say a lot of the reductions in student numbers sort of came into effect after you tightened up the rules around bringing spouses and dependents, which the previous government brought in. I guess in terms of sort of going on with the figures, I mean, look, you can never rule out another Ukraine. You can never rule out some event sort of coming out of the blue and blowing the figures out of the water. But again, I'd be surprised if the numbers changed that much drastically further. I mean, obviously that we'll have to see what the Labour government does, but those measures I suspect won't come into place for quite some time.
Thank you, Christabel.
Yeah, no, I agree with the point about universities, and I think it's especially sensitive because it will tend to be sort of lower tier universities often, so we're not talking Oxford, Cambridge, LSE here, the big universities based in the south. We're talking about quite a lot of universities in relatively deprived areas that would be worst hit by that, which would go very much against what Labour has been saying about the success to levelling up. So I think that all of these things come with trade-offs that have political consequences that I think that the government might not want to bear. And I think that that goes across overall numbers as well. The Treasury would be very, very anxious about the OBR downgrading their forecasts. I mean, that puts them in all sorts of trouble fiscally with what they, with their spending plans. So I do think that absent some geopolitical event, as Will says, that we can't predict. My hunch is that that they will balk at really wanting to push those numbers down a huge amount further.
Yeah, thank you. Marley, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think they pretty much pulled their punches on students. I think there was clearly a lot more that I think some people wanted to do, but clearly the trade-offs were too much. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if there was a temptation to come back for more on that later in the Parliament if they feel the numbers haven't gone down as much as they would like. So I think at the moment they probably shouldn't. I would have thought that higher education would be broadly happy with the white paper, but that might change. We'll see where we get to. I think that as things stand, probably the ONS forecast of sort of around 340,000 or something. Yeah, it's probably roughly where we're heading to. But again, as Will said, it's so unpredictable. Anything could kind of change the figures, and so you quite never quite know where you're going to end up on migration. But yeah, I mean, I think. Yeah, the irony is in some ways is that all the ONS did was do a kind of 10-year average, and that's probably about right. I mean, but who knows? We'll see where we get to. I think the trend is for now is downward, and with the white paper being implemented again, that'll take numbers down a bit further too.
Thanks, Marley. So last word to you, Sunder.
I think the government hopes it's heading to 340, 300 and below, and wants to get below 250 because they would feel happier, even though nobody would notice that. But also that's a sort of hedge as well in case the 340 is wrong and it's 400 or 500, that they're trying to put some downward pressure. I think universities, a fifth of the income is coming from international students. It's obviously a good thing when people are doing a good thing for the right reasons, and Indian students are coming, studying and paying back the fees by working here. I don't think it was quite a soft policy. I don't think anyone could defend all of the recruitment practices, because I think there was definitely pitching of it as a work visa in India and Nigeria. There's definitely pitching of it where you don't particularly want to do the course, and that is because the finances are unsustainable. So while higher education benefiting from international students is a good thing, having our provision of domestic higher education in this country dependent on the Nigerian, Indian, and Chinese economy is not a good thing. And so we should actually have a sustainable system that doesn't sort of rely on that over expansion among the universities who are having it toughest. So it's been a reasonably big fall. It's quite a soft policy. There's going to be a tariff or a tax maybe of 5 or 6% on the fees, which will depress numbers a little bit, but relabel some of the subsidy and maybe put £500 million in a pot somewhere that then maybe goes back to the universities as well. It's a way of just showing that the money's there. So I think the universities were worried because the government wasn't talking to the sector a lot and was making a lot of noise. I think they've got a policy they can work with, but actually the government has to fix university funding in its own right, because international students can't be the only way we fund our universities.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Well, that is the end of the webinar. Thank you all for coming, and big applause, virtual applause, and thanks to the fantastic panelists. We've certainly covered a lot of ground and been really interesting. And I just want to let you all know that you'll be very excited about this. We're about to carry out the 18th wave of the Immigration Attitudes Tracker survey. And so we'll be coming back for a webinar in a couple of months' time with those findings. In the meantime, we have other events, so have a look on our website to keep up with those. So thanks again for coming, and enjoy the rest of the day.